talk about cannabis industry bona fides. Kris Krane has them in spades. He talks about, as a young man, being part of NORML, as well as then moving on to SSDP. Takes us through what was, can be, and how that sort of turned into 4Front advisors, and his role on the NCIA, and how his time in the Czech Republic helped inform his worldview at the beginning. So we've got Kris Krane.
Hi.
The Kris Krane.
Thanks for having me here.
Right. 4Front advisors. NCIA Board of Advisors.
Board of Directors.
Board of Directors. Yes. And an activist from way back. So let's...
Making me feel old, but yes.
Yeah. So let's dive in. I mean, Kris Krane with the 2 Ks. I mean, how long have you been answering questions on that? You know?
As long as I can remember.
So, that is your birth name, and this hasn't changed. And
it's not a stage name,
right?
No,
yeah,
that's mom and dad.
Okay, all right,
that's right.
Well, congratulations, it's memorable.
Thank you.
Where are you from?
Originally from New York City.
Aha.
Grew up in the city.
Yes.
Went to college at American University in Washington, D.C., so
right.
I left New York in about 1996.
Right.
That's where I got my start as an activist, originally with the Campus NORML chapter, and eventually with what became one of the first ever SSDP chapters.
Sure.
In 1998 at American University.
Okay. And we'll get there, but I was trying to figure out why I understood your energy, and it's because you're from New York City.
Yes, so if I talk a little fast, don't hesitate to tell me to slow down.
Right, no, I won't know the difference is the point,
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Are you a native? Are you a New Yorker as well?
Native New Yorker, so where did you grow up?
Rockaway Beach, and then we moved to the Upper West Side of Manhattan.
I see, okay. And where did you go to high school?
Bronx High School of Science.
That's the good one.
Product of New York City Public Schools.
There you go. Well, that's the best one, right?
They're in Stuyvesant, yes.
Yeah. Right. Okay. And did you have a concentration at Bronx Science?
No, they didn't require concentrations in high school.
All right.
No.
What was, give us a sense of the kind of guy you were in high school, living on the Upper West Side and then busing to Bronx Science?
I was kind of a nerdy kid. I wouldn't say I was one of the most popular kids in school. I was kind of a nerd.
Okay.
But I had a great time. I got a chance to spend a semester in Prague. I was chosen actually as a sophomore in high school to participate in an exchange program. It was a citywide program, so I got exposed to sort of a global culture at a fairly young age, and that was I think pretty influential on me in terms of just exposure to other ways of living and other cultures, and that definitely informed my worldview growing up. But aside from that, I was a kid growing up in New York City. We hung out in parks and pool halls and all the things that kids in the city do.
Yeah, totally. You say you were a nerd. You know that's in style now.
It is. It wasn't so much the case in high school. I'm not sure it's still the case in high school these days. I think it's much more acceptable to be a grown-up nerd. Although hopefully the nerds in high school today fare a little bit better. Maybe the girls now recognize that these are the future millionaires of the world and treat them a little nicer.
Right. The women are smarter, so hopefully they realize that at a younger age.
They are
right?
certainly smarter. That's for sure. At all ages.
You are a true believer.
Absolutely. I got a daughter myself. I have a son and a daughter, and I mean they're both extremely young, so it's hard to say. But yeah, the girls, it happens faster with them. That's for sure.
Absolutely. How old are the kids?
1 and 3.
Oh, so real little.
Yes, real little.
Okay, and you're still with your wife?
I am, yes.
Okay, and she's smarter than you.
Absolutely.
Right.
She has a higher degree than I do. She's
actually smarter than you.
She is actually smarter than me, certifiably smarter than me. She has a master's in clinical psychology.
Right.
I just have a poli-sci degree from American University.
Right.
So no, she is the brains of the family. I'm the mouth.
Fantastic. That's how that works. Tell us about the Charles Bridge in Prague.
Oh, Charles Bridge in Prague was a really fun place to hang out. I mean, this was in 1994,
right?
So you could, at 15 years old, you could hang out with a couple of half-liter beers and sit on the bridge and watch street performers and play music with your friends. And it was an unbelievable time. It's much more touristy now.
Yeah.
It'd be that doesn't really happen today,
right?
But back then it was a great place to just go and hang out in between pubs, and it was a good place to be a 15-year-old in the late 90s or mid 90s, actually.
Yeah.
A lot more freedom as a teenager in the Czech Republic than you had even in New York City.
You say it really informed your worldview, and so great. I can see you, kind of hanging out and watching the street performers. But what do you actually mean?
When you grow up, I think when you grow up, particularly in the United States, you're fairly isolated from other cultures. If for kids who grew up in Europe, they're a lot closer to lots of other countries, other languages, other foods, other ways of doing things. We're exposed to that in a more sort of sanitized version. You might go out for Indian food or something, but that's kind of most Americans' exposure to like Indian culture, for example.
Right.
Not many people go out for Czech food because it's not a very gourmet food. It hasn't really made it in the U.S. But
no.
But it was realizing at 15 that school was very different there. Their approach to education was very different. The way they sort of lived their lives on a day-to-day basis was different than the way that we do things. They treated teenagers with a lot more freedom than we had, say, in the United States. I mean, I could go out after school with my teachers and go to the pub down the block and have a beer with my teacher, and it wasn't frowned upon. And honestly, this is one of the areas as a teenager where I started thinking about the issue of drugs more in the alcohol context.
Yeah.
Because we saw that teenagers drinking alcohol in Prague in the Czech Republic was completely normal. It wasn't frowned upon. It wasn't something that they had to go and hide. You could go to the pub. In fact, it was quite common. There was a pub right down the block from our high school where kids would go for lunch, and they might have a beer with lunch and then come back to class.
Right. And
that wasn't seen as anything weird or devious. It was just a normal part of the culture. Having a beer with lunch is normal. I was actually kind of surprised they didn't serve them in the dining hall at school,
right,
or in the cafeteria at school. But being a 15-year-old American and not having much experience with drinking at that age, of course, you get there and you go crazy with it and have your bad experiences, but very quickly realize that no, I can go out after school with my friends and have 2 beers, and that just was sort of part of our after school routine, and had no interest in getting completely wasted.
Yeah, because no one's saying no.
Because nobody's saying no. That's
right.
Exactly right. It wasn't taboo. It just completely removed the taboo. And in fact, if we did go out and get completely wasted, the Czechs would kind of frown on us, like, oh, look at these stupid Americans. They don't know how to hold their liquor, or hold their beer.
Right.
So it was, there was even sort of peer pressure not to go absolutely crazy every time you got access to alcohol.
Interesting.
And it was, and so you really had, it was a culture that was, I feel having a much healthier relationship with drinking, particularly at a young age, and then to come back to the U.S. and be, a 16-year-old, 17-year-old kid in high school and a kid in college, and watching my friends go out, and when they would have access to booze, they would, completely overdo it. That was no longer that appealing to me as a 17-year-old, because I got that out of my system, and I had lived in a place where that just wasn't necessary, and so it wasn't as appealing to me.
What you must mean that when you speak of freedom, you had a lot more freedom over there. What other ways did you have more freedom?
I think there was a lot more trust for teenagers there in general.
Trust.
Trust, exactly. The host families would let us go out after school. We could go out to concerts in the evening at 15, 16 years old, and not have to be chaperoned, or people weren't worrying about what was going to happen to you at the show, or what time exactly you had to be home.
Right.
They trusted that you would you were going to do the right thing and not do something stupid, and if you did, there were consequences for it.
Right.
But there was a much less of a distinct line between kids and adults, or particularly teenagers and adults in the Czech Republic, and I think that's true in most of Europe, compared to the United States, where there is this very clear delineation between you're a teenager and then you're adult, and you're treated very differently as a teenager. And I think it breeds more freedom when teenagers are treated with more responsibility. But I don't think it also breeds more responsible young adults. Because when you're treated like a kid, you're going to act like a kid, and you're going to sneak around, and you're going to not be as honest with your parents or with your teachers. It creates creates a little bit more of an adversarial relationship, I think, between adults and teenagers in the way we treat them in the United States. And you have, I think, slightly more responsible teenagers in some European cultures than we do here.
Yeah, and you had mentioned that they treat education differently. I would imagine some of this is what you're talking about. What else, though? How are they educating differently?
The education. So this was an interesting one where I actually, in many ways, I like the American system of education better than some of the Czech systems. Although theirs was at the time kind of a hybrid. They were just kind of coming out of communism, and there was a much heavier emphasis on tests in Europe than there is in the United States, where they take class participation into account. And in the U.S. we have a more sort of holistic view of education, where it's not just your score on the test is going to determine your final grade,
right?
But also how you participate, how you think about these things, how you discuss with your teachers. You have a series of homework assignments and quizzes and stuff. Whereas in the Czech Republic, at least at that point, it may have changed. This was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Basically, your grade was entirely on your final exam. Like, that was it.
Right.
You could basically not show up to class for an entire semester, and if you aced the final exam, you aced the class.
Right.
And that was actually one area where I think it was the reverse was true of what we were just talking about. The Czech teachers in particular, it was very much this is my class, and you're going to do exactly what I say. And it was they didn't really care what the students had to say or how they had to participate. It was I'm going to lecture you, and you're going to listen.
Right.
It was not very much in terms of like participation. Thankfully, the classes that I took were actually mostly because they were in English. This was a bilingual school where most of the Czech students took half their classes in English. So my teachers were mostly 22 to 25-year-old Americans and Brits. So they were much more accustomed to teaching smart-ass kids like myself and my friends there.
You said smart-ass kids, but you also said did you say you won some sort of competition? How did you get into the program?
It was a program that was run by, or it still is actually, run by Ronald Lauder, who was
Estee Lauder?
Estee Lauder's son.
Yeah.
He had run for governor in New York a couple times and lost, but a pretty big figure. He had been ambassador to Austria before the fall of communism. Not that it was in Austria at the time, but he was right on the border of Eastern Europe.
Right.
And had a real affinity for these Central Eastern European countries. So he started an exchange program where students from all over New York City could apply to participate. There were only about 20 who were selected per year to go to, at that time, there were 4 or 5 countries that they sent the students. So there were about 5 students per country.
Oh, wow.
That would be sent there. And we would host, so that if you got selected, and you had to apply, and you had to go through a pretty rigorous application process and interviews and home visits and all of that. And then they selected their students, and you would host a student from that country for the first semester of your, it was this second year, sophomore year of high school. And then the second semester go and stay with their family in their host country. So we went to Prague, Budapest, St. Petersburg. This was all at that time. Berlin, I believe, and they added a few other cities in the ensuing years after I left the program.
Wow, and that is right after the fall of communism.
It is, yeah.
Right?
It was about 5 years after communism fell, about 1989 to 1990. I think it was 89 in the Czech Republic, which Czechoslovakia at the time. They split into 2 countries in 92, and I was there then in beginning of 1994. So I mean, like, McDonald's was still kind of a big deal there. They had just opened their 4th McDonald's in the city when I got there. And it was like one of the most expensive restaurants to eat at in Prague at the time. I mean, you could go out to a regular Czech restaurant especially if you were outside of the downtown area. You could have a huge meal, big meal, drink 5-6 beers if you wanted to, and you would pay $5 maybe for the whole deal.
Right.
McDonald's was kind of like the fancy foreign place to eat. It's a very different place now.
Obviously. Have you been back specifically to the Czech Republic?
I have. Yeah. I still have friends there, so I've been back many times since. It's been about 5 years since the last time I was there. But to see the change from then to where it is now. Now it's still gorgeous and beautiful, but it's like any other Western European city. It's very expensive. It's very global, it's international, much more modern than it used to be. So it was a great time to be there.
And they do have a little bit of a cannabis market growing there. There's an event in November, and
they do.
And all that.
They do. They've had the Czechs have been very permissive in their attitude towards cannabis. This was also something that helped inform my view on cannabis policy as well, having been there that young. Cannabis has always been, I don't know about always, but for a long time now has been very accepted as part of Czech culture in Czech life. If you know, and they now have policies that reflect that. There's no criminal penalties at all for possession of relatively small amounts. It's actually of all drugs, but and they're moving towards more regulated. They have medical marijuana now, and they're moving towards more regulated markets around cannabis. But I mean, even 20 years ago, it was very common if you would go to a pub in the Czech Republic, people would sit around the pub and everyone would have their beer and their cigarettes and their rolling papers and their marijuana sitting in front of them, and somebody would be sitting rolling spliffs the whole time that you're sitting around the table at the pub. And while everyone's drinking, there's every 15 minutes or so there's a spliff that goes around that you get 2 or 3 hits off of as it makes its way around the table.
Right.
And in fact, most pubs in the city had their house marijuana dealer. It was very common in a lot of places. You could go up to the bartender and ask, where can I get some cannabis? And they would say, go talk to that guy, that table over there, and that you would buy your dime bag and sit around and roll your spliff. So it's very common. I mean, this is this wasn't like you had to know the places to go. This was just at most pubs, particularly the pubs that catered to younger people. And it's still very much the case.
Yeah.
At least it was the last time I was there, just a few years ago.
Right.
So it's a country that has a very permissive attitude towards this. And again, it was one of the first places that I was exposed to cannabis being just a normal part of life. There was nothing taboo about this. I mean, much like being a teenager and being able to drink and not having it be something that's frowned upon or that you have to hide, cannabis was consumed there very much out in the open. Law enforcement could care less. And it demonstrates that, hey, this is something that can be a regular part of life. It's not. It's completely innocuous. Nobody seems to mind. Nobody's getting hurt.
Right.
In fact, people are probably drinking a little bit less because they're consuming cannabis, and that is a net gain.
Right.
For their health, and probably for other people in the pub. There's not a whole lot of bar fights in Prague.
Right.
Despite the fact that they drink more beer per capita than any country in the world. The Czechs do. And part of that is they mix in cannabis with their drinking.
Right. Calm it down a little bit.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. But it was very informing that this is much like going to a coffee shop in Amsterdam would have been at the time. That this is something that can happen like a normal transaction, and that is totally normal behavior. And then when you go back to the U.S., where it's felony for possession in a lot of states, it really makes you question what the hell are we doing here? It's been demonstrated that this can be done in a better way.
Yeah, and so you go back to the States, you go into American University, you are engaging in your poli-sci major, and you find the NORML chapter. Tell us about that.
Sure. Well, this is an issue, and to back up on that a little bit, I mean, this is an issue that I've thought a lot about, before Prague, before I was a teenager. My father was a medical cannabis patient when I was very young. He suffered from it's a very rare genetic form of emphysema. So it's not one that's contracted from smoking. It's called bullous emphysema. It's genetic. It can be hereditary. I don't have it. My brother does. And he passed away from this when I was about 8 years old. It sounds counterintuitive that somebody would smoke anything to help with a respiratory condition. But we know today that the cannabis or the cannabinoids are vasodilator, meaning that they help open the lung passages. So I could see as a 7-year-old kid, when my father was having these really horrible breathing attacks and he couldn't draw breath, he could take a couple of hits off of a joint and he could breathe. And I could see that. I mean, I knew what joints. I knew joints were daddy's medicine. I didn't at that age make the connection between joints and marijuana.
Right.
But so as I got older, this is something that stuck with me. And as I went through, it wasn't quite the DARE program, it was whatever New York City's version was.
Yeah.
At the time, this stuff really rang hollow to me. This was very counter to my own experience with it. And so I thought a lot about it. Of course, I experimented with it as I got a little older and discovered I enjoyed it.
Sure.
Enjoyed it more than drinking.
Yeah.
And I started thinking a lot more about the sort of societal implications and researching and looking into it. And so I got involved, not heavily involved with NORML, but I did get involved with NORML my freshman year of college. I was a little too focused on just being a freshman in college to be super active, but I did go to meetings and got more and more active as the years went on. By my junior year, the NORML chapter morphed into a Students for Sensible Drug Policy chapter, which was 1998, this was one of we call it the inaugural 5 chapters, or basically were chapters on 5 campuses at the time. This was before we even had a national office.
Right.
And as we became SSDP, I became more actively involved in marijuana policy and drug policy. Really, at that age, at that point we were working very heavily on trying to repeal the drug provision of the Higher Education Act, which denies federal financial aid to students with drug convictions. It was a law signed by President Clinton, and that really galvanized this burgeoning student movement around the country. This was also the earlier days of the internet, and so it was the first time where you had drug policy activists on campuses that could talk to each other and coordinate with one another. So we decided to start this new national organization that was focused on more than just marijuana, and particularly in reaction to this new law denying financial aid to students with drug convictions. And so we got SSDP up and running, grew pretty rapidly, worked with the organization. I was in leadership my senior year, and then started interning at NORML my last semester of senior year, because I was only taking partial credits, and I was doing my honors political science thesis on drug policy reform. So I spent my whole senior year basically immersed in drug policy. I was researching it and interviewing all of the the leaders of the movement at the time. There were a lot less of them then than there are now.
Right.
Got an internship with NORML my second semester, when I think I only had like one credit class plus my thesis. So I spent a lot of my time at the NORML office, and literally I got hired the day after I graduated. It was very lucky. There were very few positions at NORML still today.
Yeah.
But the woman who was serving as the chapter coordinator happened to leave like the week that I graduated, and they slid me in on an interim basis, and I got the job, and I was there for the next 6 years at the national headquarters.
So since you were doing both things at the same time, SSDP and NORML, obviously SSDP is focused on students.
Correct.
But aside from that, what is the difference in the missions of the two organizations, and then also the similarities?
Sure. Well, the difference is fairly easy. NORML is a consumer advocacy group. So NORML's a little bit different than groups like, say, the Marijuana Policy Project or the Drug Policy Alliance, which are much more focused on your more traditional sort of suit and tie, button down lobbying efforts. NORML, at its best, represents the interests of cannabis consumers. That traditionally it's been hard to be sort of an authentic representative of the cannabis consuming community and also be taken very seriously as a suit and tie lobbyist. I think that's actually something that probably led to the formation of a Marijuana Policy Project. Right. There was sort of a need for both. But NORML has the most recognizable brand in drug policy reform or marijuana policy reform. They're sort of a cultural phenomenon. I mean, you see people with NORML T-shirts, and people know what that. Nobody will walk down the street with an MPP T-shirt, for example, and somebody would know who it is. It's not, MPP is not supposed to be cool, right? Whereas NORML, NORML kind of is, right? And NORML has a huge web presence. They reach more people than any of the drug policy organizations. So that was really the focus. My role there was actually, particularly early on, was actually doing student organizing for NORML. So I was working very closely with the leadership at SSDP while I was at NORML. I was our campus coordinator. I was our chapter coordinator, but I was much more comfortable dealing with the college students because I was 22, 23 years old, and our regular chapter leaders were, some of them were 20, 30 years older than me. And, who the hell was I to tell them how to go about their business? But I knew a lot about campus organizing, and so I just kind of took it on myself to focus more there, and I coordinated very closely with SSDP, got NORML chapters involved in passing resolutions to call on Congress to repeal the drug provision of the Higher Education Act, and really made sure that NORML and SSDP were working very closely together at the campus level. Where SSDP differs is, SSDP is not a consumer advocacy organization. SSDP is essentially the student wing of the drug policy reform movement. So SSDP is incredibly important for a number of reasons. One of them, it's the organization that's best positioned to focus on issues that directly impact youth and students. So issues like the Higher Education Act drug provision, random student drug testing, the ONDCP's youth anti-drug media campaign, the propaganda ads that are targeting young people. It's an organization that is well positioned and credible when taking on these issues. But also SSDP, and I think most importantly, serves as, number one, the foot soldiers of the broader movement, really the grassroots base of well-trained activists, and also the training grounds for future leaders of the movement in the industry. And I think that's what makes, in my mind, SSDP arguably the most important drug policy organization around today. while they don't have the budget to run initiatives like an MPP or a DPA, which are, immensely important, they can go and for a relatively small amount of money, which is something that SSDP is doing right now. For example, in advance of the 2016 election and the legalization campaigns that we're likely to see in at least 5 states, SSDP for a relatively small amount of money can go and put organizers on the ground in these states a year in advance of the campaign who are going to spend time on campuses, start new chapters, organize the grassroots. And so by the time you get closer to the campaign, these are kids, students who are going to knock on doors, set up phone banks, do get out the vote efforts, turn out young voters, all things that we need in a campaign. So an organization like MPP or DPA doesn't have to go and pay these political firms to bring out people to do this type of work.
Right.
We have these people on the ground. We only need to pay for one organizer to work for a year. So maybe a $50,000 cost would be less than it would cost the organization to hire, paid professionals, and those paid professionals are not very good for the most part, right? Because they don't care about this issue.
Right.
They may be phone banking, one day for marijuana legalization and the next day for, gay marriage ban. They're gonna phone bank or door knock for whoever's paying them to do it, whatever issue.
Yeah.
So they're not passionate about it. They're not trained about it. They're reading a script.
Yeah.
Whereas these kids are they've been learning about this for a year. They've been training on this for a year. They understand the issues. They're super passionate about it. And so when they call a voter or they knock on a door, right, that passion's infectious. They're much more likely to turn that person into a voter.
Right.
And you also, it's not just the people on the ground in that state. The SSDP played a tremendous role in Colorado and in Oregon last year, setting up vote banks all over the country. They literally coordinated with their student chapters, and they have chapters on about 250 campuses around the country. All of these chapters set up phone banks on their campuses, got lists from the campaign of likely voters in Colorado and Oregon, and we're phone banking. You're phone banking. You don't have to be in the state. So you had kids in Connecticut, in Minnesota, in Florida, and all over the country are calling voters in Oregon and encouraging them to turn out to vote. So this is it's a tremendously impactful organization in terms of getting policies changed that does more with their budget than anybody, I think, by a fairly wide margin. And then, of course, they're training the next generation of drug policy reformers and industry leaders. When we hire entry-level people at 4Front Advisors, we almost exclusively hire kids coming out of SSDP. And when you look at the ranks of the drug policy reform movement at NORML, at SSDP, at the national office, at DPA, at MPP, you've got SSDPers in important positions in all those groups. Now with the industry, which this didn't exist when I was coming out of college, right? You had basically those 4 or 5 organizations and that was it.
Yep.
And they don't have many positions. And if they weren't hiring, you went somewhere else. Yeah. Now there's dispensaries, there's grow facilities, there's ancillary businesses, there's a whole industry that's sprung up around this. So somebody's coming out of SSDP, they have a lot of opportunities to them. And as an employer, you want somebody who cares about your business, who cares about your issue. Where are you going to find a better recruit than somebody that's spent their college career dedicated to reforming marijuana laws, reforming drug laws? That person's going to be about as passionate and highly motivated an employee as you could possibly get.
Yeah. And whereas you were running SSDP and Betty is now, we